For years, Evelyn Voss told the world that pain made her powerful. Her story inspired millions. But buried in a forgotten corporate filing was a date that didn't make sense. Two brothers noticed it, and once they followed the timeline, they realized something terrifying. Their father's death wasn't just an accident. It was a cost calculation. They had no money, no lawyers, no influence, just documents. And sometimes, documents are more dangerous than anger. Evelyn Voss did not inherit her empire. She engineered it from memory, loss, and relentless narrative control. To the American public, she was the embodiment of reinvention. Her childhood struggles had been documented in interviews, her early financial hardships retold in best-selling memoirs, and her rise to billionaire status framed as proof that resilience could be monetized without shame. She spoke on national stages about surviving instability, about sleeping in cars, about learning to transform humiliation into hunger. Her voice carried the calm authority of someone who had endured and conquered. The city admired her not just for her wealth, but for the emotional blueprint she offered. Pain could be leveraged, vulnerability could be strategic, and suffering could be shaped into influence. Her foundation funded youth programs. Her streaming specials chronicled her journey with cinematic lighting and carefully timed pauses. Audiences leaned forward when her voice trembled. Investors leaned forward when her brand trended. Every public tear seemed authentic, yet somehow positioned perfectly within the frame. Every hardship felt real, yet refined. Evelyn did not merely tell her story, she curated it. She understood that in modern America, narrative was currency, and she had mastered its exchange rate. Yet beneath the polished cadence of her speeches was a quieter layer of calculation. Her investment firm expanded aggressively, acquiring distressed companies, restructuring them, and selling them for profit. The public rarely connected her philanthropic persona with her corporate machinery. To most, she was a symbol of healing. Few examined the cost of her growth. Across the city, far from gala stages and penthouse views, Malik Turner and Jaden Cole lived in a neighborhood where opportunity arrived slowly and left quickly. Their apartment overlooked a strip of aging warehouses and cracked sidewalks. The skyline shimmered in the distance like a separate country. They had grown up listening to stories about their father, Daniel Turner, a factory supervisor who believed steady work meant steady dignity. Years ago, a machinery malfunction at his plant ended his life. The official report called it an accident. The settlement was brief and final. Their mother accepted what little explanation she received because fighting corporations required resources she did not have. Malik, the older brother, carried questions he rarely voiced. Jaden carried anger he tried to disguise as humor. Neither boy followed billionaire headlines closely. Evelyn Voss was simply a name associated with charity banners and televised speeches. But the city's contrasts pressed on them daily. They walked past billboards bearing her image on their way to a bus stop that rarely ran on time. They passed newsstands featuring magazine covers celebrating her empire of empathy. They noticed how admiration seemed to erase scrutiny. The tension between polished power and silent poverty did not yet feel personal, but it lingered. Malik had begun spending afternoons in the public library researching trade programs and apprenticeship options. He told himself he was looking forward, not backward. While navigating public business records one afternoon, he stumbled across an archived acquisition notice from years ago. The corporate name attached to the factory where his father had worked caught his eye. He assumed it was coincidence until he read further and saw the acquiring firm listed in small print, Voss Capital Holdings. He leaned closer to the screen. The acquisition date was months before the accident. Another filing showed the subsidiary had been divested shortly after media attention faded. The timeline felt too precise, too quiet. Malik's pulse tightened, not with rage but with clarity. He printed the document, folded it carefully, and slipped it into his backpack without telling Jaden what he had found. Across town, Evelyn finalized preparations for another keynote address about accountability and growth. She believed firmly in the story she told. She had survived chaos and built control from it. She did not consider herself responsible for events that occurred within vast corporate systems. Oversight was delegated, risks were calculated. Losses were unfortunate but distant. Her empire was built on forward motion, not retrospection. As the sun lowered behind the skyline, Malik unfolded the paper again beneath the dim light of his bedroom. The date on the acquisition document did not align with the timeline his family had been given. Something about it felt incomplete, as if a crucial paragraph of history had been omitted. He did not yet know that this single page would challenge the most admired narrative in the city. Malik did not confront Jaden immediately. Instead, He returned to the public library the next afternoon with a quiet urgency that felt heavier than anger. The acquisition document was no longer just a coincidence. It was a fracture in a story the city had long accepted as whole. He logged back into the business registry database and began tracing the corporate lineage of the factory where their father had worked. The company name had shifted over the years, folded into holding groups and spun off again, but the paper trail was still there for anyone patient enough to follow it. Jaden joined him reluctantly 2 days later. He believed in protecting what little stability they had left. Digging into billion-dollar firms was not survival, it was risk. Still, loyalty overruled caution. He sat beside Malik beneath the hum of fluorescent lights as spreadsheets, archived filings, and quarterly reports accumulated on the screen. They were not hackers or financial experts. They did not break into systems or manipulate data. They simply read, cross-referenced, and refused to look away. The official accident report described a sudden mechanical failure. No prior warning, no negligence, just tragedy. But buried in an archived compliance disclosure, Malik found a reference to pending safety upgrades postponed due to budgetary reallocation. Another document revealed an internal memo summarizing inspection concerns weeks before the incident. The language was sterile, corporate, and distant, yet the timing tightened something inside him. Equipment irregularities had been noted. Repairs had been deferred. Production quotas had remained unchanged. What unsettled them most was not a single memo but the pattern. Evelyn Voss's firm had acquired controlling interest in the parent company months before the accident. Investor communications celebrated operational optimization and cost discipline. Then, less than a year after the fatal incident and its brief news cycle, the subsidiary was quietly divested. The transaction appeared strategic, almost routine. Yet to Malik, it read like a door closing. Night after night, the brothers returned to the library, their backpacks filled with printed pages they could barely afford to copy. They pieced together fragments the way other teenagers assembled playlists or college applications. Each line of financial language translated into a question. Each date became a thread. The deeper they went, the less accidental the timeline appeared. The moment that shifted everything came when Malik located a settlement summary attached to a corporate liability filing. It was labeled Confidential Resolution. Several employee claims were listed numerically, without narrative detail. Near the bottom of the page, their father's name appeared in small, compressed text. Next to it was a payout amount significantly higher than what their mother had ever mentioned receiving. Malik stared at the figure until the numbers blurred. Either the filing was inaccurate, or something had been withheld. Jaden leaned closer, reading the page twice, then a third time. The air between them thickened with realization rather than outrage. If funds had been allocated under corporate resolution, where had the difference gone? Had their family signed documents without understanding the full compensation? Or had the terms shifted behind closed doors? Across the city, Evelyn's public narrative continued uninterrupted. Interviews replayed her reflections on overcoming adversity. She spoke about ethical leadership and responsible capitalism. Her audience saw strength. The brothers began to see a mission. The question forming in Malik's mind was no longer whether negligence had occurred, but whether accountability had been managed rather than pursued. Late one evening, as the library prepared to close, Jaden accessed a court database index listing sealed motions connected to the factory's legal aftermath. Most were procedural. One entry, however, referenced executive awareness of risk exposure. The motion was sealed from public view, but a partial preview displayed the initials EV in the margin annotation. Jaden printed the docket reference without speaking. When he placed it beside the acquisition document and the settlement summary, the pattern no longer looked circumstantial. It looked intentional. For the first time, the brothers understood that they were no longer just reviewing history. They were standing at the edge of a concealed narrative that someone powerful had once ensured would remain closed. Evelyn Voss had spent most of her adult life mastering the distance between memory and presentation. To the public, her past was a clean arc: unstable childhood, financial insecurity, relentless ambition, triumphant reinvention. What few understood was that instability had not only shaped her hunger for success, it had shaped her fear of losing control. Growing up in households where promises dissolved overnight, she learned early that survival depended on anticipation. She studied rooms before entering them. She studied people before trusting them. Most of all, she studied narratives before allowing them to define her. Control became her quiet obsession. Wealth was not simply about luxury, it was insulation. Influence was not vanity, it was protection. By the time she founded Voss Capital Holdings, she had convinced herself that the world rewarded only those who acted decisively. Hesitation invited collapse. Compassion without structure invited vulnerability. She framed her philosophy as pragmatic resilience. Beneath it lay a misbelief she rarely examined. Survival justified compromise. In private meetings, she listened more than she spoke. Executives presented risk assessments and restructuring strategies with detached precision. When distressed companies appeared on acquisition lists, she evaluated them not as communities but as assets. She believed in systems, in efficiency, in optimizing broken infrastructures. If layoffs were required, they were unfortunate but necessary. If upgrades were delayed for fiscal positioning, they were temporary adjustments within a larger plan. She told herself she was building influence that would eventually fund greater good. The scale of her philanthropy, she reasoned, outweighed isolated corporate casualties. Her public persona radiated empathy. Her private reasoning operated on calculation. She did not see the contradiction because she believed outcomes defined morality. If her foundation educated thousands, then the corporate maneuvers that financed it were justified. The world was not gentle, she reminded herself. It was competitive. Those who hesitated lost everything. Locked in a cabinet within her home office was a thin leather folder labeled "Contained." It was not an official archive but a personal one. Inside were summaries of past corporate crises that had required careful management, lawsuits settled quietly, compliance investigations resolved without publicity, operational failures reframed as transitional setbacks. Among those documents was a brief report regarding the factory accident from years earlier. The page noted prior safety recommendations, the timeline of acquisition, and the post-incident divestiture. It also included legal language confirming settlement, distribution, and closure. She rarely opened the folder. When she did, it was not with guilt but with vigilance. The file did not represent wrongdoing in her mind. It represented exposure. She had not personally caused machinery to fail. She had inherited a struggling company and delegated oversight. Responsibility, she believed, flowed through layers of management. She told herself the accident was tragic but systemic, not personal. If there had been delays in safety upgrades, they were decisions made collectively within financial constraints. She had moved the company forward and later moved it out of her portfolio. Business evolved. Incidents did not define intent, yet the fact that the document remained in her private folders suggested something deeper than strategic awareness. It suggested unfinished resolution. Occasionally, in quiet moments between interviews and board calls, she would recall the factory's name and feel a flicker of discomfort she could not categorize. Not guilt exactly, but unease. She countered it by reviewing her philanthropic milestones, reminding herself of scholarships funded and shelters built. Scale, she believed, corrected imbalance. On the morning her communications director presented new media engagement metrics, Evelyn appeared composed, focused on expansion into new digital platforms. Her brand continued to grow. Public trust remained high. She prepared for another keynote address emphasizing ethical leadership in modern capitalism. The language had been refined to precision. Later that afternoon, a notification arrived from her legal department. 2 private citizens had submitted a formal request under a public transparency clause, seeking access to archived corporate liability records related to a subsidiary divested years earlier. The request cited specific acquisition dates and referenced compliance memoranda. Evelyn read the notice twice. The factory's name appeared clearly in the subject line. For a moment, the polished architecture of her narrative felt less solid. Someone had followed the paper trail far enough to reach the door she believed long closed. She closed the email without responding, but the word, "contained," no longer felt certain. The documents no longer felt like scattered anomalies, they felt like weight. Malik spread the printed pages across the small kitchen table late one evening while the city outside settled into its usual hum. Acquisition filings, compliance disclosures, settlement summaries, docket references. Each sheet represented a fragment of a story that had never been told in full. Jaden stood near the window, arms folded, watching headlights sweep across the street below as if expecting consequence to arrive before decision. Reporting the findings to authorities seemed logical in theory, but neither of them trusted that logic. Regulatory agencies required legal framing, formal complaints, resources they did not possess. Anonymous tips could be ignored. Formal accusations could invite scrutiny back onto them. Evelyn Voss did not operate alone. She had attorneys, advisors, crisis consultants. She had the kind of influence that reshaped headlines within hours. The imbalance was obvious. Jaden worried less about truth and more about survival. He had seen how quickly powerful figures reframed narratives. If they went public and failed to prove intent, they would be dismissed as opportunists exploiting tragedy. Their father's name could become a footnote in an online debate. Worse, their family could be dragged into unwanted attention. The risk was not physical confrontation, it was reputational erasure. Malik understood the fear, but something steadier had taken root inside him. The more he reviewed the timeline, the more silence felt like participation. If safety warnings had been acknowledged and delayed for financial positioning, then their father's death was not simply misfortune. It was a decision absorbed into quarterly strategy. Accepting that quietly felt like accepting that some lives were negotiable. Their loyalty to each other became the center of the conflict. Jaden did not doubt the documents, he doubted the outcome. Malik did not doubt the danger, he doubted their ability to live with inaction. The tension between them was not loud or dramatic. It was restrained, layered with shared history and unspoken grief. They had survived hardship by staying aligned. Crossing this line could fracture that balance. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. While reviewing an archived corporate governance database, Malik located a transcript excerpt from a board meeting conducted weeks before the accident. It had been attached to a shareholder dispute unrelated to the factory itself. The excerpt referenced production efficiency targets and capital expenditure delays. One passage stood out with unsettling clarity, a discussion about postponing non-essential equipment upgrades to preserve quarterly optics during restructuring. The language was clinical, detached, almost casual. Safety was framed as an adjustable variable within financial forecasting. Malik read the paragraph twice before sliding the page toward Jaden. Neither spoke immediately. The transcript did not name specific employees, but the timeline aligned precisely with the compliance memo they had found earlier. The pieces interlocked without force. The delay was strategic. The risk had been known. In that moment, the debate shifted. Reporting anonymously to regulators might bury the information in procedural delay. Confronting Evelyn directly would likely be deflected by legal counsel. But investigative journalism operated differently. Public scrutiny could not be contained in the same way as internal review. Exposure created pressure no private negotiation could replicate. The decision was not framed as revenge. It was framed as refusal. Refusal to allow their father's life to remain an accounting adjustment. Refusal to let a narrative of resilience overshadow unresolved responsibility. They did not seek to destroy a person, they sought to illuminate a pattern. After researching local reporters who specialized in corporate accountability, they selected one investigative journalist known for methodical verification rather than sensationalism. Malik compiled the documents into a secure digital folder at the library, removing any identifying metadata. Jaden reviewed the files once more, ensuring nothing could trace directly back to their home. Their caution was deliberate, not paranoid. The email they drafted was concise and factual, outlining the acquisition timeline, the safety memo, the settlement discrepancy, and the board transcript excerpt. They attached the documents without commentary about motive or blame. The evidence would need to speak on its own. When they finally pressed send from a public terminal, neither felt triumphant. The act felt quiet, almost anticlimactic. Yet something irreversible had shifted. The documents were no longer confined to their kitchen table. They left the library without speaking, aware that waiting might be harder than deciding. The journalist did not rush the publication. For nearly 2 weeks, she verified every date, cross-checked every filing, and confirmed the authenticity of the board transcript excerpt. She contacted former employees of the factory, reviewed archived inspection reports, and consulted corporate governance analysts about the acquisition timeline. The evidence did not scream scandal, it whispered inconsistency. That was enough. When the exposé finally appeared on a small but respected digital news platform, it carried a restrained headline and a careful tone. It outlined the acquisition of the factory by Voss Capital Holdings, the documented safety concerns raised prior to the accident, the delay in upgrades described in a board discussion, and the discrepancy in settlement figures. The article did not accuse Evelyn Voss of direct intent. It questioned oversight, accountability, and transparency. It invited response. At first, the piece circulated quietly. It was shared among niche forums focused on corporate ethics and regulatory compliance. The city did not erupt. Markets did not react. Evelyn's foundation continued posting pull updates about scholarship initiatives and community grants. The silence felt almost anticlimactic to Malik and Jaden, who monitored the article from borrowed library computers and prepaid phones. They told no one. They waited. The shift came when a nationally recognized blogger known for dissecting power narratives amplified the story. He framed it not as a financial oversight but as a contradiction between brand and behavior. Within hours, the article trended across social platforms. Cable panels referenced it cautiously. Comment sections multiplied with speculation. The whisper became a current. Evelyn's public relations team moved with practiced efficiency. A formal statement was released describing the claims as misleading interpretations of historical corporate records. The statement emphasized that the factory incident had been investigated and resolved years prior, that Voss Capital had acted responsibly within legal frameworks, and that settlement agreements were confidential for the protection of affected families. The language was calm, controlled, and firm. It reframed the narrative as opportunistic revisionism. Supporters rallied quickly. They cited Evelyn's philanthropic track record, her advocacy for workplace reform, her transparency, and other ventures. To them, the timing of the article seemed suspicious, perhaps politically motivated. They argued that successful women in power often face disproportionate scrutiny. Loyalty to her story had become emotional currency for many. Critics, however, focused on the unanswered questions. Why had safety upgrades been postponed? Why did settlement figures appear inconsistent? Why was the acquisition divested so quickly after the accident? Online threads dissected financial documents line by line. Independent analysts debated whether legal compliance equaled moral responsibility. The city did not fracture violently, it divided intellectually. Trust, once automatic, became conditional. Malik and Jaden watched from the margins of the storm they had helped initiate. They felt neither vindicated nor secure. Their anonymity protected them, but it also isolated them. Every televised defense of Evelyn tightened something in Jaden's chest. Every demand for transparency steadied Malik's resolve. The story had left their control the moment they pressed send. Now it belonged to interpretation. Evelyn appeared on a morning news program 3 days after the article's amplification. Her demeanor remained composed. She acknowledged awareness of the resurfaced documents, but insisted that the incident had been addressed appropriately at the time. She emphasized her commitment to ethical leadership and dismissed suggestions of deliberate negligence. Her voice carried conviction. For many viewers, it restored equilibrium. Then, late one evening, a second development surfaced online. An anonymous source released a short video clip extracted from a board meeting recording dated weeks before the factory accident. The clip captured executives discussing cost containment strategies and explicitly referencing the postponement of certain safety investments to maintain quarterly performance optics during restructuring. The language mirrored the earlier transcript but carried the unmistakable weight of tone and context. The clip spread faster than the original article. This time, there was no ambiguity in phrasing. The postponement was acknowledged plainly. By midnight, news outlets were requesting official comment. Evelyn's earlier televised assurance now stood beside a recorded discussion that complicated it. The narrative was no longer about interpretation of documents, it was about contradiction. And somewhere in the city, behind locked doors and glowing screens, decisions were being made about how far this revelation would be allowed to travel next. The release of the board meeting video altered something fundamental in Evelyn Voss's carefully structured world. Documents could be interpreted. Statements could be reframed. But tone, cadence, and timing carried a different weight. The recording did not portray chaos or malice. It portrayed calculation. It revealed a room of executives weighing safety investments against quarterly optics, speaking in the steady language of strategy. The calmness of it unsettled the public more than outrage would have. Inside Voss Capital, conference rooms filled quickly. Advisors discussed reputational containment. Legal teams reviewed exposure thresholds. Investor calls grew tense. While no formal charges had been filed, uncertainty alone triggered caution. A major institutional partner announced it was reevaluating its position pending internal review. Market analysts shifted from admiration to scrutiny. Headlines no longer celebrated resilience, they questioned responsibility. Evelyn maintained composure in meetings, but something quieter was unraveling beneath the surface. For years, she had believed her guiding principle was necessary realism. Survival demanded decisiveness. Leadership required prioritization. If harm occurred within complex systems, it was tragic but diffuse. She had never framed herself as indifferent. She had framed herself as strategic. That distinction now felt thinner. Late one evening, long after her executive team had left the office, Evelyn unlocked the cabinet in her private study and removed the leather folder marked contained. She had not opened it since the first article surfaced. The word on its cover, once reassuring, now felt presumptive. She carried it to her desk and began reviewing the document slowly, without interruption. The compliance memo referencing equipment concerns was still clipped neatly behind a summary sheet. The board transcript excerpt, once an abstract reference, now echoed with the tone from the leaked video. She paused at the inspection report, noting deferred maintenance categorized as non-critical under revised budgeting priorities. At the time, she had skimmed the report as part of a broader restructuring overview. She remembered thinking the issues would be addressed in the next fiscal phase. She remembered trusting the operational managers to escalate anything urgent. What unsettled her now was not direct intent but proximity. She had been closer to the decision chain than she had allowed herself to acknowledge. The delay had not been an accident of ignorance. It had been an accepted trade-off within a financial strategy she approved. For the first time since the controversy began, her reaction was not centered on defense. It was not about optics, investor confidence, or media narratives. It was about consequence. A family had received a phone call that altered their lives permanently. She had reviewed spreadsheets during that same quarter, celebrating operational stabilization. The distance between those realities had once felt procedural. Now it felt personal. Public pressure intensified the following week. Advocacy groups demanded independent audits. Commentators debated whether legal compliance shielded moral failure. The language surrounding her name shifted from admiration to inquiry. Her foundation's social media accounts filled with requests for clarification rather than praise. Even longtime supporters began asking measured questions rather than offering unconditional defense. Evelyn sensed the fracture in her internal logic. The belief that scale justified compromise had anchored her decisions for decades. If she built enough schools, funded enough scholarships, improved enough lives, then earlier trade-offs were absorbed into progress. But the argument no longer felt stable. Philanthropy did not reverse a delayed repair. Influence did not erase a lost parent. In the quiet of her study, she closed the accident file and stared at the city skyline beyond her window. Control had always been her armor. Anticipate risk, manage narrative, contain fallout. Yet this situation had bypassed containment entirely. Someone had followed the trail deliberately, patiently, and without seeking spectacle. The precision of it unsettled her more than hostility would have. The next morning, instead of instructing her legal team to escalate countermeasures, she made an unexpected decision. She contacted the investigative journalist who had published the original expose and requested a private meeting. Her advisors cautioned against engagement without legal framing, but she insisted on direct conversation. Her final request before ending the call was not about publication timelines or editorial angles. She asked to know who had exposed the files. The anonymity did not last. Investigative reporting, once accelerated, develops its own gravity. Through careful cross-referencing of document access logs, archived public database timestamps, and subtle digital traces left during record retrieval, the journalist was eventually able to narrow the source to two individuals. Their names were not released immediately, but they were verified. Malik Turner and Jaden Cole were no longer invisible observers. They were participants in a public reckoning. When the journalist informed Evelyn privately that the sources were the sons of a deceased factory supervisor, something in the revelation altered the tone of the unfolding crisis. This was no longer an abstract dispute about governance standards or shareholder optics. It was personal, specific, and human. The narrative had a face. Speculation spread quickly once the identities surfaced through independent reporting. Commentators debated their motives. Some portrayed them as courageous whistleblowers driven by grief. Others suggested opportunism. Social media accounts analyzed their backgrounds, their neighborhood, their education, as if legitimacy could be measured by circumstance. The city did not erupt in chaos, it entered a state of moral examination. Instead of initiating legal action for unauthorized document distribution, Evelyn made a decision that surprised even her closest advisors. In a formal public statement, she announced the commissioning of an independent investigative review into the factory acquisition, safety oversight processes, and settlement structures tied to the incident. She pledged full cooperation and transparency within legal boundaries. Additionally, she declared that a compensation review panel would reassess prior resolutions to ensure fairness and completeness. Her statement was carefully worded. She acknowledged oversight failures in corporate systems under her leadership, but stopped short of admitting deliberate negligence. She framed the initiative as an opportunity to strengthen accountability standards across her entire investment portfolio. The tone balanced responsibility with restraint. The public reaction was mixed. Supporters viewed the announcement as evidence of integrity under pressure. Critics questioned whether the review would be truly independent or strategically controlled. The word performance surfaced repeatedly in commentary. Was this genuine accountability, or a refined adaptation of the brand she had always mastered? Malik and Jaden were approached discreetly by legal intermediaries representing Voss Capital. Offers were extended for private settlement discussions that could include financial compensation beyond any prior agreement. The outreach emphasized confidentiality and closure. The message was framed as restorative rather than defensive. They declined. Their refusal was not impulsive. They had anticipated that financial resolution might be offered once their identities became known. But money alone did not address what had driven them to act. They wanted structural reform, public acknowledgement of procedural failure, and safeguards to prevent similar decisions from recurring. Their father's name, they believed, should not be reduced to a negotiated figure. It should be part of a corrective record. The refusal intensified media interest. Commentators began contrasting the vast resources of a billionaire executive with the measured resolve of two young men who insisted on systemic change rather than personal gain. The narrative shifted subtly from confrontation to principle. Malik and Jaden did not present themselves as adversaries of wealth. They positioned themselves as advocates for accountability. Pressure mounted for Evelyn to address the matter directly before a broader audience. A live press conference was scheduled, not pre-recorded or selectively edited, but broadcast in real time. Analysts speculated about tone and strategy. Would she double down on procedural defense? Would she offer a carefully calibrated apology without liability? Or would she maintain the balance she had attempted in her written statement? On the day of the conference, cameras filled the room. Reporters lined the aisles. Evelyn stood behind a podium with prepared remarks displayed on a teleprompter in front of her. Her posture was composed, her expression measured. She began by reiterating her commitment to transparency and systemic review. The language was precise, professional, controlled. Malik and Jaden watched from a modest living room across the city, surrounded by silence heavier than anticipation. The city watched with them. Halfway through her statement, Evelyn paused. Her eyes shifted from the scrolling text on the teleprompter to the audience beyond the lights. For a moment, the cadence of scripted leadership faltered. Then she stepped away from the teleprompter entirely. When Evelyn Voss stepped away from the teleprompter, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. The room, accustomed to controlled language and polished cadence, felt the pause before the pivot. For years, she had delivered speeches engineered for resonance. This time, her voice carried something less rehearsed and more deliberate. She stated plainly that executive leadership included responsibility not only for profits, but for the consequences of strategic delay. She acknowledged that under her authority, cost decisions had intersected with safety concerns in ways that should have been escalated differently. The phrasing did not dramatize the past, but it did not distance her from it either. Then she announced what few had predicted. An independently administered restitution fund would be established for every family affected by the factory incident, regardless of prior settlement terms. The fund would not be conditioned on confidentiality agreements. It would operate transparently, with oversight from external workplace safety advocates and legal scholars. She further declared that she would step down from the corporate board of Voss Capital Holdings to allow structural reform to proceed without her influence shaping its direction. The reaction was immediate but layered. Some commentators called it calculated sacrifice, a strategic concession designed to preserve legacy. Others described it as the first authentic fracture in a brand built on invulnerability. Investors responded cautiously, noting both the financial implications and the symbolic significance of a founder relinquishing authority. The city did not erupt into celebration or condemnation. Instead, it absorbed the moment with measured reflection. Evelyn continued by announcing a redirection of her foundation's mission. Future initiatives would focus exclusively on workplace safety reform, regulatory transparency, and executive accountability standards across industries vulnerable to cost-driven compromise. The foundation would fund independent audits, support whistleblower protections, and create scholarships for families affected by industrial negligence. The emphasis shifted from personal storytelling to systemic change. The narrative she had once centered on herself began to widen beyond her image. Across the city, Malik and Jaden watched the broadcast without expression. The announcement did not restore their father. It did not rewind the years shaped by absence. Yet it altered something intangible. Their insistence on structural accountability rather than private compensation had reshaped the outcome. They had not sought applause, and they declined interview invitations that promised exposure. When approached about speaking engagements or book offers, they refused. They preferred anonymity over celebrity. Their intention had never been to dismantle a person, it had been to illuminate a process. Public perception of them evolved quietly. They were described as symbols of civic courage, young men who leveraged documentation rather than outrage. Their restraint strengthened their credibility. In neighborhoods where skepticism toward power was habitual, their story traveled as proof that persistence could disrupt hierarchy without spectacle. In corporate circles, their actions prompted internal reviews in companies far removed from Voss capital. The ripple extended beyond one boardroom. The restitution fund began processing claims within weeks. Some families accepted quietly. Others engaged publicly, contributing testimony to broader regulatory discussions. The independent review panel released preliminary findings acknowledging systemic oversight failures during the acquisition period. The language was clinical, but its implications were undeniable. Decisions once categorized as operational adjustments were reframed as ethical crossroads. For Evelyn, the aftermath was neither triumphant nor catastrophic. She retained wealth and influence, but the invulnerable aura that once surrounded her had shifted into something more complex. Her resignation from the board did not erase her history, but it marked a boundary between authority and accountability. Redemption, it could be called that, was incomplete. It required continued transparency, not a single announcement. The city adjusted slowly. Conversations about executive responsibility became more nuanced. Media coverage of corporate acquisitions included sharper scrutiny. Philanthropy was no longer accepted automatically as moral insulation. The change was not dramatic, but it was real. In the quiet that followed the headlines, one truth lingered. Power had not crushed poverty. Instead, truth had confronted power and altered its trajectory. Yet, beneath polished empires across the skyline, countless decisions remained archived in silent files. And somewhere beyond public view, the question waited: how many other stories still rest inside folders labeled contained? If this story moved something in you, don't let it end here. Stories like this only matter when they're heard, shared, and discussed. If you believe truth should never be buried under power, make sure this message reaches someone else who needs to hear it. And before you leave, ask yourself this: if you discovered a truth powerful enough to shake an empire, would you risk your comfort to expose it? Or would you convince yourself it's not your responsibility? Tell me your answer in the comments.